The story begins not with an army, but with a whisper from far away, from the city of Jerusalem, sacred to Christians, Muslims, and Jews alike. In the late 11th century, this holy city was under Muslim control, and reports, some true, some exaggerated, reached Europe that Christian pilgrims were being blocked, even harmed, on their sacred journey.
Oh.
The tales stirred hearts in the West, already beating with faith and fear. In 1095, that whisper became a roar when Pope Urban II, standing in an open field at Clermont, France, raised his hands before a sea of knights and peasants and cried out for a holy war, not for gold or land, but for the soul of Christendom. God wills it. The crowd shouted back, again and again, their eyes burning, not with hatred, but with purpose. The Pope's call was unlike anything Europe had heard. He promised forgiveness of sins, eternal salvation, and heavenly reward. For those who would take up arms and march east to reclaim Jerusalem, it wasn't just a military mission, it was a spiritual journey, a pilgrimage of steel. Across villages and kingdoms, men left behind their families, their farms, and their fears. Some were knights seeking glory, others were commoners seeking redemption. Even children followed, barefoot, eyes wide, unaware of the horrors that awaited. This movement, what history would call the First Crusade, began not with kings, but with the people. Led by charismatic preachers like Peter the Hermit, they formed unruly mobs, many of whom never even made it past the borders of Europe. Chaos followed in their wake, attacks on Jewish communities, looting, hunger, and death. But behind the madness was a strange unity. For once feuding nobles and distant kingdoms marched under a shared symbol, the cross. They wore it on their tunics, their shields, their hearts. The road ahead was long, across the Alps, through the Byzantine Empire, and into the unfamiliar heat of the East. Yet the goal burned in their minds: Jerusalem, the city of light, the city of Christ. And so, the first wave of the Crusades began, not with strategy or soldiers, but with belief. The march eastward was not a parade of glory, it was a brutal test of body, soul, and conviction. After Pope Urban II's call, tens of thousands began the perilous journey toward Jerusalem. Walking across frozen rivers, scorching plains, and hostile lands. Many died before even reaching enemy territory from hunger, disease, or the blade of fellow crusaders turned lawless. But in 1096, the real First Crusade, led by noble lords like Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, Beaumont of Taranto, and Tancred, reached the mighty gates of Constantinople. Suspicion stirred. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios I saw these holy warriors as both allies and threats. He demanded oaths and made uneasy alliances, guiding the Crusaders into Anatolia. There, the war truly began. The Turks were fierce, fast, and unfamiliar enemies, but the Crusaders pressed on, driven by visions of paradise. Cities like Nicaea, Antioch, and Edessa became battlegrounds of myth. At Antioch, the Crusaders were besieged, starving, diseased, and betrayed. Yet they held on, claiming a holy relic, the lance of Longinus, said to have pierced Christ's side, had been discovered beneath the ground. Faith flared once more, and they charged out of the gates with renewed fury, defeating a much larger Muslim army. Antioch fell, and then, at last, they turned toward their dream, Jerusalem. In 1099, they arrived before its walls, weary and worn, but unbroken. The siege lasted weeks. They built siege towers, filled moats, and scaled walls, while priests prayed and men wept. And then, on July 15th, they broke through. What followed was not divine, it was devastating. The Crusaders, who had traveled thousands of miles in the name of God, unleashed horror upon the city. Muslims and Jews were massacred. Blood ran through the streets of Jerusalem knee-high, some said, but to the Crusaders it was victory. They knelt at the church of the Holy Sepulchre and wept with joy. Godfrey refused to be called king in the city of Christ, and instead took the title defender of the Holy Sepulchre. The First Crusade had succeeded, a miracle in their eyes. But behind the hymns of praise was the heavy silence of what had been lost. The city was taken, but innocence was not. The sword had spoken not for land or crown, but for belief, and the echoes would be felt for centuries. Jerusalem was theirs for now, but victory, as the Crusaders soon discovered, was only the beginning. After the bloodshed faded and hymns quieted, a new challenge emerged: how to hold what they had taken. In the heart of the Holy Land, surrounded by people who did not welcome them, the Crusaders began building kingdoms from the ashes. These became known as the Crusader states, fragile Christian islands in a Muslim sea. 4 major realms rose: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli. Their names sounded noble, but inside, these states were constantly on edge, thinly defended, poorly supplied, and always under threat. Kings and lords who once marched together now ruled apart, and unity began to crumble. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, ruled first by Baldwin I, tried to govern through diplomacy, marrying local women, striking fragile truces, and building castles, strongholds like crack-day chevaliers, carved into hills like stone prayers for survival. Life for common people was difficult. For Muslims, Jews, and Eastern Christians still living under Crusader rule, tolerance varied. In some cities, there was uneasy peace. In others, discrimination and violence. Still, trade routes reopened, cultures collided, and a strange kind of coexistence flickered. European pilgrims began arriving in waves, bringing spices, silks, and stories. Knights from faraway lands joined military orders like the Knights Templar and Hospitallers, sworn to defend pilgrims and the cross with their lives. These weren't just monks with swords, they became bankers, landlords, and warriors there. Black and white crosses flying high across the desert. But while some dreamed of peace, others plotted revenge. Muslim leaders, once divided, began to unite. New whispers came from Egypt and Syria, whispers of a rising force that would one day strike back. Still, for a time, the Crusader states stood tall. Churches were built, laws were written, kings ruled from thrones they had never imagined. But beneath the surface, cracks deepened. Pride, politics, and the impossibility of maintaining distant rule weighed heavily. As new crusades were planned in Europe, no one realized the fire that had conquered Jerusalem could just as easily consume it. The cross had risen, yes, but so had the storm. Barely a generation had passed since Jerusalem fell into Christian hands, but already the dream was slipping. The Muslim city of Edessa, the first Crusader state ever founded, fell to the powerful Turkish general Zengi. It was a devastating blow. Edessa had been seen as a symbol of divine victory. Now it was a warning. Word reached Europe, and soon the Church responded with another call to arms. Thus began the Second Crusade, launched in 1147. But this time, it was kings who led the charge: Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany. Unlike the First Crusade, born from raw passion and common faith, the Second Crusade was slower, more organized, and ultimately, more tragic. The journey across Anatolia was a disaster. Poor planning, ambushes, and disease decimated the German forces. The French fared no better. Suspicion between the two armies grew, and morale crumbled before they ever reached the Holy Land. When they did, they aimed not at Edessa, which was now too far gone, but at Damascus, a powerful and rich Muslim city. But this decision proved fatal. Despite initial gains, the crusading army was repelled, exhausted, and forced into retreat after just 4 days. It was a humiliating defeat, and worse, it united Muslim rulers who saw that the Crusaders were not invincible. The Christian kingdoms in the east began to feel abandoned. Their allies in the west had come, failed, and returned home in shame. Meanwhile, new leaders emerged in the Muslim world, none greater than Nur ad-Din, Zengi's son, who expanded his power and promoted the idea of jihad as both a spiritual and military duty. He wasn't just fighting for land, he was fighting for faith. Back in Europe, the Second Crusade left a bitter taste. Trust in the Church's promises wavered. People began to wonder, had God truly willed it this time? For the first time, the idea that crusading might not guarantee victory took root. Yet in the East, the storm was only gathering strength. A greater leader was rising, one who would soon become a legend, feared and respected by both enemies and allies. His name was Saladin, and with him the winds of war would soon return to Jerusalem. As the sun set over the Holy Land, a new dawn rose for the Muslim world in the form of Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, the man the West would come to know as Saladin. Like many of his time, Saladin wasn't just a soldier. He was a scholar, a unifier, and a deeply devout leader. He rose through the ranks under Nur ad-Din and later carved his own path, eventually founding the Ayyubid dynasty and becoming Sultan of both Egypt and Syria. While Christian kingdoms squabbled, Saladin built an empire patiently, wisely, and with a singular vision to reclaim Jerusalem. In 1187, he finally struck. At the Battle of Hattin, his forces crushed the Crusader army, capturing relics, knights, and even King Guy of Lusignan himself. The road to Jerusalem lay open. And so, after nearly 90 years, Saladin marched into the Holy City, not as a butcher, but as a conqueror of mercy. Unlike the bloody conquest of 1099, Saladin spared civilians, allowed Christian worship, and ensured safe passage for those who wished to leave. It was a moment that would echo through history, but Europe did not stay silent, shocked by the loss. Of Jerusalem, a new crusade was called, the Third Crusade, and this time it would be led by kings: Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip II of France, and Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire. Barbarossa died before reaching the Holy Land. Philip returned early, but Richard stayed and he burned with determination. What followed was a campaign filled with legendary moments. Richard captured Acre after a brutal siege, and in a chilling act of war, executed over 2,000 Muslim prisoners when negotiations failed. Battles like Arsef showcased his brilliance. Even Saladin admired his courage. The two were enemies, but never monsters to each other. They exchanged letters, gifts, even doctors. Yet despite Richard's victories, Jerusalem remained beyond his reach. Supplies dwindled, alliances weakened, and eventually, in 1192, Richard agreed to a truce with Saladin. Christians would keep coastal cities, and pilgrims could enter Jerusalem peacefully. Richard departed, never having seen the holy city with his own eyes. Saladin died the following year, his kingdom still poor because he had given so much to the cause. And so, the Third Crusade ended, not with a sword, but with a handshake. The clash of titans faded into the wind, leaving behind a legacy of honor, heartbreak, and humanity. In that brief moment of mutual respect, both cross and crescent had found common ground, if only for a while. If the First Crusade was about faith, and the third about honor, then the Fourth Crusade became a tale of greed, confusion, and betrayal. It began in 1202 with noble intentions. The goal, to strike at Muslim Egypt, now seen as the key to retaking Jerusalem. But the Crusaders lacked ships, and so they turned to the powerful merchant city of Venice. The Venetians agreed to build a fleet, but when the Crusaders couldn't pay the full price, the deal twisted. The Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo, an old and cunning man, had other plans. He redirected the Crusaders to attack the Christian city of Zara, a rival port. Shockingly, they agreed, spilling Christian blood for the sake of debt. The Pope excommunicated them, but still the crusade rolled on. Soon after, a young Byzantine prince named Alexios Angelos approached them. He promised vast riches and support if they helped him reclaim the throne of Constantinople, the Christian capital of the Byzantine Empire. Tempted by gold and power, the Crusaders again shifted their course away from Jerusalem, away from Islam, and toward one of the holiest Christian cities in the world. In 1204, they stormed Constantinople. The attack was savage. Churches were looted, relics stolen, women violated, libraries burned. The ancient city, once home to emperors and saints, was torn apart by men who claimed to fight for Christ. Statues were melted, icons shattered, and even the great Hagia Sophia was desecrated. For 3 days, the Crusaders rampaged, blind with greed. They crowned their own puppet emperor and established the short-lived Latin Empire, ruling over a land that hated them. The Fourth Crusade never reached the Holy Land. It never even fought Muslims. Instead, it tore apart the heart of Eastern Christianity, deepening the divide between Catholic West and Orthodox East, a wound that still hasn't fully healed. Many historians consider it the moment the Crusades lost their soul. What began as a mission to reclaim Jerusalem had become an empire of contradictions, faith twisted by politics, hope drowned in blood. And as the fires of Constantinople faded into ash, the world watched in stunned silence. And this was not the glory of God, it was the tragedy of man. In 1212, as Europe still reeled from betrayal and broken promises, a strange and heartbreaking tale began to take shape, one that didn't start with kings or knights, but with children. Legend tells of a young French shepherd boy named Stephen, of Cloyes, barely 12 years old, who claimed he had received a divine vision. Christ had called upon him to lead a new crusade. His mission? To peacefully reclaim Jerusalem with innocence, not swords. Thousands of children, some as young as 7, believed him. Word spread, and soon another movement sparked in Germany under a boy named Nicholas. These young souls, armed only with hope and songs, began marching to the Mediterranean, convinced that the seas would part like the Red Sea and God would guide them to victory. But no miracle came, and he perished from hunger, exhaustion, or were taken by wild terrain. Those who reached port cities like Marseille were betrayed, sold into slavery, tricked onto ships that never returned. Some say they drowned at sea. Others were sold into the markets of North Africa. The Children's Crusade wasn't a triumph, it was a tragedy born from desperation, and it marked a turning point. Over the next century, more crusades would be called the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, and even the 8th, but none could match the fire of the first. Egypt became the new battleground, and brave figures like King Louis IX of France would fall into enemy hands or die trying. The Muslim world, meanwhile, had grown stronger, more united. The dream of reclaiming Jerusalem faded further with every passing year. Back in Europe, the once sacred word crusade began to change. It was used against heretics, political enemies, even other Christians. The purity of the original cause dissolved in politics, greed, and power. By 1291, the final Christian stronghold in the Holy Land, the port city of Acre, fell. The last Crusader knights boarded ships and sailed away, the red cross on their shields faded by salt and sorrow. The Crusades had ended, not with a grand victory or dramatic defeat, but with a quiet retreat. Centuries of conflict, hundreds of thousands of lives, rivers of blood, all had passed like dust in the wind, yet their echoes remained in architecture. In memory, in the bitter scars between East and West, the Crusades had promised heaven, but too often delivered hell. And as the last Crusader looked back at the fading coast of the Holy Land, perhaps he wondered not who won, but what was truly lost. As you drift away into the quiet of the night, let the echoes of the past carry you. The Crusades were not just battles fought with swords, but dreams, beliefs, and burdens passed through centuries. History is not always black and white. It lives in the gray between hero and villain, truth and myth. If this story stirred your soul, subscribe for more journeys through forgotten time. Every week, we fall asleep to history. Together, good night. And may the past guard your dreams.